This presentation is about disaster risk reduction measures. My name is Dongeren. I'm the coordinator of RISC-KIT and I work at Deltares in the Netherlands. In this talk, we'll talk about the definitions of risks, hazards, exposure and vulnerability as we use them in the RISC-KIT project. And we'll do a classification of DRR measures in terms of factors of risk and prevention, mitigation and preparedness measures. In the RISC-KIT project, we based ourselves on the UNI-SDR definitions as outlined in their 2009 booklet on disaster risk reduction, with supplemental definitions by Goulby and Samuels, 2004, The Language of Risk, Helm and Klein. Risk has many definitions. What we use is a simple one, which combines the probability of the hazards times consequences, which is consistent with the language of risk. So those two elements can be broken down as follows. On the one hand, you have the hazard. This is a physical event that causes harm. We're not defining the hazard as the storm or the surge, which happens at sea. We're defining the hazard as something that has the potential to do harm, something that happens on land. So that involves the event, the storm and the surge, but also the pathway, the route that the hazard has to take to reach the receptors and the receptors themselves. And receptors can be buildings or persons. On the other hand, we have the consequences or impacts. And we use the definition by Klein, which breaks consequences down further into exposure and vulnerability. Exposure is the quantification of the receptors that may be susceptible to a harm. Like I said before, this could be a number of people, type of properties, etc. Each of these receptors can be exposed to the hazard, and each of these receptors have a certain ability. And the vulnerability can be further broken down into sensitivity and value, again using the definition by Klein. So sensitivity is the measure in which a receptor will experience harm. And the value can be quantified in terms of monetary amounts, but it can also be done qualitatively, high, medium, or low. An example of sensitivity is raising houses on stilts. If a house is put on the ground level and experiences a certain water level, it will experience a certain damage. But if you raise it up, the sensitivity will go down. The damage will go down because you reduce the sensitivity. All this is part of risk management. It's a systematic approach and practice of managing uncertainty to minimize flood potential and harm and loss. What comes out of this risk assessment is classification of measures, either in preventive, mitigative, or preparedness. Preventive measures are the ones that completely avoid the impacts. Total avoidance is usually not feasible, and there's a little bit of gray area with the other category called mitigation. But the intention of preventive measures is to completely avoid the impact of a hazard. For instance, dams, embankments, and dikes, sometimes also referred to as protection. Mitigation, on the other hand, are types of measures that lessen the impact of a hazard. For instance, zoning, building restrictions, building codes, but also building marshes, etc. They will not completely avoid the impact of a storm, but they will lessen the effect. And preparedness measures are those to help make an effective response to the impact of a hazard. For instance, early warning systems, evacuation plans, and risk communication plans. Finally, resilience is the ability of the system to resist and to recover from a hazard. In that sense, it's the inverse of sensitivity. So we have two ways of defining risk and to classify measures. If you define risk and break it down into hazard times exposure times vulnerability times value, and if you break down the measures according to prevention, mitigation, and preparedness, you can start to classify measures in this matrix. So if you want to influence the hazard and you want to prevent the impact, you can have dike or dune building solutions. If you want to mitigate the hazard, you can implement nourishments or build marshes or nature-based flood defenses. If you want to reduce the exposure, you can even remove houses that will completely prevent impacts from happening, or you can implement the preparedness measures such as early warning systems and evacuation. A mitigative effect which affects the vulnerability are building codes or elevating houses or floodproofing. And to reduce the value, you can build cheaper buildings in the hazard zone. This is not a comprehensive list, but this is a way to start mapping measures against classification and the risk factors.